as Drew said, the title is not what's in the bulletin, the program. This is a blatant case of bait and switch. I tried to use Augustine to draw you in, and now I've got you. I should say one other thing. As he introduced me, my area is historical theology with a focus on patristics, which means my work tends to be a rigorous engagement with patristic figures in order to engage contemporary theology, which I think is a legitimate use of the fathers. So what I will be doing with Ambrose here is slightly different than many of the papers that we've gotten to hear at this conference so far. All right, so forming a more perfect fellowship, Societas and Misericordia in Ambrose of Milan. In his 1997 Carus Lectures entitled Dependent Rational Animals, Why Human Beings Need the Virtues, Alistair MacIntyre seeks to correct what he deems to be an oversight among social ethicists, a neglect of what he calls the virtues of acknowledged dependency. The prevailing task of virtue theorists in the Western tradition has been to facilitate the maturation of students into independent, rational agents. In other words, individuals capable of making moral judgments for themselves rather than blindly following the values of their parents, teachers, or society. One unfortunate consequence, however, has been the loss of a sense of mutuality, an acknowledged dependence on other members of the community, such that we imagine the virtuous service of others as altruism, that unidirectional flow of benefits from the virtuous benefactor to the beneficiary, and not much the other way around. MacIntyre places the blame for this at the feet of his hero, Aristotle, who taught that it was unmanly to expect help from others to carry our burdens, and who, in his paragon of virtue, the great soul man, is depicted as one being eager to confer benefits, but feeling shame at receiving them, or even being reminded of them. With this lost sense of dependence, we have replaced the egoism of self-interested desire with the egoism of what he calls bland generalized benevolence, in which our only relationship with those we are serving is that they, quote, provide an occasion for the exercise of our benevolence, end quote. MacIntyre's corrective is to establish a social ethic that is genuinely social, a relational ethic that integrates the virtue of independent rational agency and the virtues of acknowledged dependency. One problem he sees, though, is finding a moral vocabulary that will do just that. In this respect, the Western philosophical tradition, he says, is lacking, for neither justice nor generosity are adequate terms, since they are not reciprocal. One can be just without being generous, and one can be generous without being just. Where is one then to find an understanding or a language for just generosity that is truly reciprocal or relational? The closest he comes is Thomas Aquinas' idea of misericordia. Where there is compassion, there is mutual distress of the suffering of others, such that the alleviation of my neighbor's suffering simultaneously frees me from distress. MacIntyre's project is an important step, especially for Christians, if we are to get beyond an ethic where charity is so easily confused with condescension or largesse. What is lacking, however, in MacIntyre is a robustly Christian account of mutuality that is the source of misericordia. This afternoon, I will argue that in Ambrose's adaptation of Societas and Misericordia, we find a concept of mutuality that both addresses MacIntyre's concern, but is grounded solidly in the work of Christ. In Deo Vigis Book 1, Chapter 28, Ambrose introduces the idea of Sokietos into his account of justice. Quote, "Justice restores the Sokietos of the human race and community. The logic of Sokietos consists of two elements, justice and generosity, which is also called liberality or kindness. Justice is viewed as the loftier principle, while generosity is deemed more pleasant. The former retains careful judgment, the latter, goodness." End quote. Now, within Ambrose's corpus, the meaning of Sokietos is twofold. It may refer, on one hand, to an actual group of people, a society, a fellowship, or even an alliance. But it also may refer to a disposition or affection which unites individuals into such a fellowship. This affective sense of Sokietos I will translate the bond of fellowship. In what follows, I will argue that Ambrose's concept of Sokietos not only unites justice and generosity, but also is the source of compassion that infuses the virtues with that sense of mutuality that stands in contrast to the unilateral munificence of Aristotle's great-souled man. Before turning to Ambrose's account of Misericordia, we need to begin with an understanding of the relationship between Sokietos and Justitia. Thus, part one. Sokietos, as a political concept, first appears in De Officiis during Ambrose's discussion of the cardinal virtues. Having put forth pithy definitions of each of the virtues, Ambrose reverts to his inductive, exemplarist approach to moral discourse, focusing on our ancestors, the patriarchs of Israel, whose lives serve as a mirror of moral instruction. He writes, quote, "Our ancestors defined prudentia as knowing the truth. Then they defined justitia as looking after the fellowship of the human race. Therefore, David says, he distributed, he gave to the poor, his justitia remains forever. The just man is compassionate, and he shows kindness. To the one who is just and wise belongs a whole world of riches. The just man holds what is common as his own, and what is his own as common." End quote. In the paragraph that preceded this, Ambrose had begun by defining wisdom as belief in God, because it is the source of all virtues. Not surprisingly, he alludes to Proverbs 9:10, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Therefore, when he turns to justice, Ambrose illustrates the connection between wisdom and justice by quoting David's encomium to the wise in Psalm 111. It begins, "Blessed is the man who fears the Lord. He delights greatly in his commandments." But then it goes on to describe the life of a sage who has, quote, "distributed, he has given to the poor, his justice endures forever." What is particularly interesting here is his identification of Sokietos as the telos of justitia. Justice is looking after the Sokietos of the human race. The connection between justice as the means and Sokietos as the end hinges on the tension between the personal and the common good. His initial definition of justitia in chapter 24 has three parts. 1. Allowing everyone to have what is his. 2. Laying no claim to someone else's. And 3. Disregarding what is beneficial for the self for the sake of fairness for all. Parts 1 and 2 are concerned with protecting the individual's rights to her own, both in the positive sense of allowing an individual to have what is hers, and in the negative sense of not seizing or taking away what is another's. Ambrose's idea of justitia, therefore, erects a wall to protect spheres of personal autonomy against the incursion by those who would deprive others of such rights. But in the third part, Ambrose's definition qualifies the individual sphere of autonomy. The limit to this sphere that Ambrose sets up is not simply a case of the mutual recognition of spheres, what we would say today, my rights end where your rights begin. Rather, justice requires that the individual disregard or be independent or be indifferent to or not even lay claim to what is personally advantageous in order to protect the common and public equality. This is consistent with his earlier definition of justitia as, quote, allowing each to have what is rightly hers and foregoing what is beneficial for the self for the sake of fairness. While this might be construed as a logical corollary of the first two parts, one does not seek personal advantage by violating another's sphere. It may also mean, and this is what I think Ambrose is really concerned with, not exercising certain rights at certain times which, though personally beneficial, would compromise the common good. This justice entails, therefore, a limitation on one's autonomy for the sake of the collective welfare. The conception of justice as the disregard of personal advantage for the sake of the common good reflects Ambrose's view of the relationship between the individual and a larger community. First, human beings were made social animals because of their need for mutual assistance. Appealing to God's rationale for forming Eve as a helpmate for Adam, it is not good for man to be alone. Let us make him a helper. Ambrose asserts that the obligation to give aid to one another is grounded both in God's will and in the order of nature. The value of such aid, however, is not reducible to the mutual necessity for survival. Rather, Ambrose sees such aid as contributing to the sweetness, gratia, of our life together that strengthens the bonds of fellowship. By extension, therefore, quote, no one should keep back from doing his duty by fear of danger. Each of us must regard every situation as something which concerns him personally, no matter what the circumstance, adverse or favorable. The operative phrase here is, each of us must regard every situation as something which concerns him personally. This is the essence of societas as the effective bond between individuals. The need of another is my own need. This confident sense of mutual regard for the other's need, even at the risk to one's own life, fosters those bonds of fellowship, giving justice its glory and setting the just person at the very pinnacle of virtue. Although this view is an extrapolation of Genesis 3, Ambrose is also drawing pretty heavily on Cicero's definition of societas. For Cicero, the service of the common good which builds up societas is grounded on an innate sense of the bond of mutuality that unites individuals into a community. He speaks of societas as an affection for the interests of others and a sense of mutual dependence implanted by nature. Societas began as an inchoate sense arising from one's experience of affection and dependence within the family. As one grows from childhood, reason extrapolates from the experience of intra-family dependence and grasps the interest of the greater body, the interests beyond the self, the interests of the state and of the family of human beings as a whole. Thus, the study of philosophy provides a theoretical understanding of societas that, quote, calls scattered human beings into the bond of social life, unquote. In sum, for Cicero and Ambrose, Justice builds up the bonds of fellowship because the individual has a just understanding of his relationship to the larger group or group of individuals, and so fulfills his obligation to those who are dependent on him and on whom he is dependent. Ambrose's conception of justice as an individual's obligation to serve others in need is foundational for his understanding of the relationship between private goods and common goods, which inform his sense of justice and generosity. For Ambrose, there is a fundamental reciprocity between personal and public goods. Quote, "To the one who is wise and just belongs a whole world of riches. The just man holds that which is common as his own, and what is his own as common." For Ambrose, the individual is anything but an autonomous monad moving among other individual autonomous monads without violating their sphere of autonomy. Rather, the individual sees herself as a member of the whole, contributing to and sharing in the common good. This view of the private and the public puts Ambrose's conception of justice and of societas fundamentally at odds with that of the philosophers, by which he means Cicero and Cicero's sources, who define justice as doing no harm except to those who provoke by inflicting injury, and two, as holding what is common for the sake of the public and what is private for the sake of oneself. Although Cicero shares with Ambrose, and indeed is the source of Ambrose's view, that justitia and beneficentia are elements necessary to preserve societas and associates societas with the common bonds, communitas, Cicero defines justice as upholding a strict division between what is common and what is private. Justice entails using common things for the common and the private for one's self. Although Ambrose agrees with Cicero that in the state of nature there is only that which is common, Ambrose rejects Cicero's defense of private property because he sees the unnatural impulse to delimit the private from the common as antithetical to justice and undermining the spirit of societas that holds the community together. The loss of the natural state, where all goods are viewed as common goods, Ambrose explains, comes from a primal greed, which privatizes that which is held in common. And here especially he has the idea of land. Avarice leads to the breakdown in societas, because it reflects the loss of both justice and generosity, because the greedy individual separates his interests from those of his neighbor. He no longer sees his well-being as tied up with the well-being of his neighbor, but instead lives primarily, if not exclusively, for his own advantage. In sum, justice and generosity are simultaneously expressions of societas and necessary conditions for societas. To put it simply, in childhood, we develop an innate sense of mutuality. Through philosophical reflection, the wise person comes to grasp the necessity of justice and generosity for societas. At the same time, the more we act justly and generously toward our neighbor, the more we build up the confidence and pleasure in one another that constitutes the very bonds of societas. There are, moreover, certain virtuous dispositions or affections that Ambrose sees as corollaries of societas. Among the most important of these, for understanding the relationship between Ambrose's moral psychology and his view of community, is misericordia, compassion. That brings us to part 2. As we saw earlier, Ambrose appealed to Psalm 111 appeals to Psalm 111 to provide a biblical account of the relationship between Justitia and Sokietos. Having defined the telos of justice as looking after the Sokietos of the human race, he illustrates how justice strengthens the bonds of fellowship by quoting Psalm 111, verse 9. The wise man distributed, he gave to the poor. His Justitia remains forever. But then, in the very next sentence, he jumps back to verse 5. Quote, a just man feels compassion and shows kindness. Justus miseretur, justus commodant. Why does Ambrose reverse the order of the psalm, placing verse 9 before verse 5? This reversal, I would suggest, has the rhetorical effect of, first, defining what constitutes just action, namely attending to the needs of the poor, and then identifying the affective motive for caring for the poor, namely misericordia. Misericordia logically follows as a corollary of Sokietos, because where there is a deep sense of mutual dependence and familial affection, the suffering of any one member or group elicits emotions ranging from sympathetic concern to genuine personal distress among the other members of a group. Therefore, in a community united by Christian bonds of fellowship, just generosity toward the poor, which provides for the material and emotional requirements for their flourishing, arises out of that mutual compassion for sisters and brothers whose suffering is the cause of our shared distress in the community. The importance of misericordia in Ambrose's moral theology is most clearly seen in the De Officiis, when he identifies misericordia as the virtue which is distinctive of the Christian life, what he calls officium perfectum, to use Cicero's language. Commenting on Jesus' conversation with the rich young man, Ambrose uses the young man's recognition of the inadequacy of the law for salvation and his ensuing question to Jesus, what must I do to be perfect? To contrast the basic moral duties of Torah with the higher, perfect level of virtue that is required of Christians. If one would be perfect in virtue, something more is required than simply following the Decalogue. Jesus' reply gives Ambrose a description of this perfect duty. Sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. This is an image, Ambrose says, of the perfection of our Heavenly Father, the perfection which Jesus binds on his followers in the Sermon on the Mount, the perfection of the God who commands the sun to shine upon the just and the unjust. Here, Ambrose unites Jesus' instruction to sell all one's possessions in order to provide for the poor, and his description of our Heavenly Father as one whose goodness extends to all people without distinction. He sums these two ideas up in a single word, misericordia. Quote, good is the compassion which makes people perfect, since it imitates the Father's perfection. Nothing commends the Christian soul as much as compassion. First, in one who cares for the poor, so that you judge parts of nature as common, which produces the fruits of the earth for all people to use, and give to the poor what you have, and assist the one who shares your common humanity. End quote. Two things stand out about this passage. First, his description of misericordia is identical with his understanding of justice as providing for the poor. That's not surprising. But moreover, second, even though he does not use the word sokietos, he grounds the work of compassionate justice to the poor in our bond to the poor with our brothers and sisters, consortes, because they share our common humanity. Moreover, such fraternal compassion for the poor reflects the perfection of God, who, because he is no respecter of persons, intends the land and its fruit to serve the common needs of his creatures. No place in Ambrose corpus, however, does one see the concomitancy of compassion and the bonds of fellowship as much as in the homilies on the patriarch Joseph. These sermons come at the climax of his Lenten-long narration of the virtues which should characterize the life of the catechumen after baptism. Ambrose lifts up Joseph, especially for the elite of Milan who served in imperial government, as an exemplar of prudence and justice in the stockpiling of grain against the public want from the days of famine that were to come. But even more than prudence and justice, Joseph is an example of perfect virtue because of his compassion. At the beginning of the Joseph homilies, Ambrose spells out for his catechumens in black and white exactly what moral message he expects them to take away from these sermons. Quote, "The theme of the entire story has come to this, that we may know that the perfect man is not tempted to wrong by avenging his suffering, and does not pay back evil in return. Joseph, who lived before the Gospels, showed compassion when harmed, and forgiveness when attacked." Similarly, in the De Officiis, Ambrose speaks of Joseph's compassion as the very pinnacle of virtue. Quote, "And what about his greatness of spirit? His brothers sold him into slavery, yet he took no revenge for the injustice they had done him, but chose to banish their hunger instead." End quote. It is precisely such perfection, manifest in the compassion for his brothers, that makes Joseph the perfect prefiguration of Christ, whose compassionate justice was manifest in his self-emptying compassion at the Incarnation. Equally interesting in this Christological reading of the Joseph saga is the figure of Jacob. Ambrose says that Jacob, even as Jacob sent Joseph to see if all was well with the sheep that his brother tending, Christ's Father sends him to save the lost sheep of Israel. Jacob's weeping when he sees Joseph's coat covered in blood and thinks his son is dead parallels God the Father's lament for lost Israel. For our purposes, Jacob's relationship with Joseph is the foundation for his compassion for the fratricidal brothers who sold him into slavery. When Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, he says two things. First, "It is I am Joseph." And second, "Is my father still alive?" Ambrose sees here a parallel with Jesus' own self-disclosure to the people he. Ambrose explains the significance of this juxtaposition of Joseph's self-revelation, "I am Joseph," and his question concerning the status of his father Jacob. Ambrose does this by putting his own gloss on the statement into Joseph's mouth. Quote, "Because I do not deny my father, I know my brothers. If you recognize your brother, or a father recognizes his son, is my people still alive then? From the family of that people, I have chosen a brother for myself." End quote. Now, Ambrose's gloss may have been just as cryptic to the catechumens in the 380s and 390s as it is to us in the 21st century. But the sense of the gloss seems to be this. Because Joseph claims Jacob as his father, he must also claim these men as his brothers, because they are all children of his father. In other words, the fraternal bond that Joseph retains for the very men who sold him into slavery is derived from their shared connection with Jacob. Since a people is called or known by the name patriarch, when Joseph asks, "Is my father still alive?" he is asking about the whole of Jacob's tribe. Ambrose then seamlessly moves from the scene in Joseph's tribunal, where Joseph gives the invitation to his startled brothers, "Come to me." Ambrose then shifts and places these words in Jesus' mouth. Come to me, because I have come near to you. Yes, even so far that I have made myself a sharer in your nature by taking on flesh. To his catechumens, Ambrose is giving the Christological meaning of the Joseph story. The Joseph, who in the beginning of the homilies is praised for the perfection of his compassion for his brothers, turns out to be the Father's only Son, who draws sinful humanity to himself by assuming their nature and so becoming their brother, that he might deliver them from death into life. Then Ambrose Jesus says to his brothers, to us, if at least, if you do not know the author of your salvation, do not flee from a partaker of your sokietas. In other words, by his incarnation, Christ has entered into the bonds of human fellowship, and by that union with our nature, has created a new sokietas that binds human beings with God. Even as Joseph forgave his brothers for selling him into slavery, saying, now, therefore, do not be grieved, and let it not seem a hard case that you sold me here, for God sent me before you. So too, Jesus from the cross forgives those responsible for his death. The significance of this forgiveness, Ambrose contends, Jesus makes clear at his words to the terrified disciples on Easter. Peace to you. Do not be afraid. By entering into the natural fellowship with those who share a human nature, the divine Son who was without sin offered himself as payment for the debt of sin, so that his brothers might be freed from slavery to sin and death and enjoy the freedom of new fellowship with God. What is distinctive about the correlative relationship between sokietas and misericordia in the Joseph homilies is that the bond of fellowship is derived not primarily from Ambrose's understanding of nature, the order of nature, or common property, as in the Deovicians. Rather, Joseph's compassion for his brother is ultimately an expression of his love for their father Jacob. It is because of Jacob's love of his sons who have gone astray that Joseph is moved to love and forgive his brother. But then, Joseph's compassion for his brother grows out of a bond grounded in their father's love for all his sons. And because of that, then, Joseph's acts of compassion restore the sokietas broken by his brother's malicious actions toward him. There you see the way in which sokietas is both the expression, or rather, that misericordia is both the expression of sokietas and the means of repairing sokietas. For Ambrose catechumens, these homilies illustrate how Christ, by his merciful condescension to sinful humanity, has entered into fellowship with us, that he might draw us into fellowship with his Father, and by extension, into fellowship with one another. Conclusion. As we have seen, Ambrose's notion of sokietas provides the integration of justice and generosity that MacIntyre is looking for. Where the bonds of fellowship exist, there is a sharing of that which is common, and even a foregoing of that which is personally advantageous, to ensure that each member of the fellowship has not only what she needs for flourishing, but also that she enjoys the intrinsic sweetness of sokietas that is akin to the blessings of friendship. More than that, however, Ambrose's understanding of the relationship between misericordia and sokietas is more robust than MacIntyre's account, precisely because it is grounded in God's compassion, manifest in Christ. When MacIntyre answers the question, what is the source of compassion that gives the relief of suffering a proper sense of mutuality, he cites the Christian philosopher, the Chinese philosopher Mencius. Quote, human beings have the mind that cannot bear to see the suffering of others. When human beings see a child fall into a well, they all have a feeling of harm and distress." End quote. Thus, MacIntyre says, the urgency of need awakens a natural feeling of compassion that impels individuals who have no relationship other than their shared humanity to act for the rescue of the child in the well. There are emotions, then, of delight and grief at the success of the rescue that are shared both by the child and by the rescuers alike. Thus, for MacIntyre, the source of misericordia is what we might call a sense of humanitas. Yet, Mencius's scenario is persuasive because the person trapped in the well is a child, a figure of innocence. But what would happen if we recast the scenario, replacing a child with an officer in the Gestapo, a Southern slave overseer, or a Somali warlord? Is humanitas sufficient? In other words, is this natural affinity sufficient to foster a compassion for one's enemies? That compassion which creates the conditions for the possibility of forgiveness and true reconciliation, without which there is no reconstructing a broken community. To be sure, Ambrose's account of misericordia is every bit as grounded in natural law as that of Cicero or of Mencius. Had Ambrose stopped with a natural account of Societas, he would have nothing new to add to this conversation. Fortunately, Ambrose did not stop with natural law. By situating our natural Societas within the context of the Incarnation, he elevates that Societas of common humanity into the Societas between God and humanity that is born of Christ's assumption of our nature. Thus, the new Societas between God and man creates the condition for a new Societas between people. Moreover, by narrating the Incarnation through his figural interpretation of the Joseph saga, Ambrose illustrates how Christ's fellowship that unites righteous God with sinful humanity creates the possibility for something more than a generic, natural sense of compassion, but a compassion that extends even to the unworthy, even to the enemy. Joseph's brothers did not merit mercy. They did not merit it by any classical standard of clementia or liberalitas. Therefore, Joseph's compassion was conditioned by his father's love. So too for Ambrose. The Christian's compassion is not limited by the merits of the person in distress. Rather, it is conditioned by God's compassion, which fashioned Christian fellowship at Easter and then at Pentecost with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and which continues to refashion a divided body of Christ and a badly broken world until we attain that more perfect fellowship which mirrors the fellowship and unity of the triune God, whom we confess and worship. Thank you. I intentionally left time so that we could have some discussion.
So our other mic has died, so if you have a question, please stand up and be loud.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I forget the exact wording of your quote, but I got the gist of it. You said, no one should back out of their duties due to fear. Wouldn't Ambrose argue that if grace was present, that you could go through without fear?
Good. I think you'd have to make a distinction between fear as I think you would have to make a distinction between fear that is the immediate emotional response to a particular situation, and that fear which is morally limiting. In other words, as the Stoics would say, a fear to which you give assent. I mean, my understanding of Ambrose's moral psychology is, yes, one may well experience those emotions, but what grace does is allow us to act according to our duty rather than following the emotional impulse. Yes, Andrew.
Yes. So my question is about the limits of Sarkietas. So this quotation that you have from Vicky's 125, it says our ancestors, right? And then it goes on.
Right.
And that implies that it has more to do with the church, right? And there's a little bit of an ambiguity in your talk as to like who is this Sarkietas, right? Is it the church or is it the world at large? And I'm wondering how you would answer that according to Ambrose in his historical situation. The four that he has in mind, are they any Milanese who's in trouble, or is it just members of his congregation? And then, of course, there's modern political ramifications of this as well.
Okay, good. A lot there to unpack. What was the first part of the question again?
What's the extent of the
On the one hand, since Christ came and assumed our nature, it therefore is Christ entering into the natural Sokietas with all human beings, all right? But then, for the church, especially when you think about the context of the catechumens, teaching them what it means to live as Christian community, then the sense of community, the fellowship which is created, out of that, namely the church, is a way of talking about the appropriate relations, therefore, between wealthy Christians and poor Christians. But I think he also, there's no immediate passage that's coming to mind, but I think he is very concerned that it is the need of the person that is the reason for exhibiting liberalitas, rather than sort of their worth. In other words, whatever merit they have becomes secondary to the primary need. The primary concern, are they in need? And that's going to stretch across, both boundaries between Christians and non-Christians.
I suppose part of it is to what extent, or who's the neighbor? Right?
Yeah, right.
Just to that.
Yes, Marius.
Yes. You didn't speak about the term communitas, but I think it was also in Ambrose communitas.
Right.
And so it's different question of different situation. What does he mean with communitas? And what does he mean with Sokietas? Or is it the same for him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there are times in which he will obviously use certain terms which are virtually synonymous and then have a slight nuance of difference. I mean, the difference between, fides and devotio. I mean, they're virtually synonymous.
Well, actually, the Sokietas, the Sokiare, is together.
Uh-huh.
And communitas is more, you have something common.
Right, but I think the reason you would see the two as virtually synonymous is that the affective sense of coming together is based on what you share in common. And hence part of his critique about, owning the defense of private property and so forth. But I mean, that is an area in which, if this paper were expanded, that I think that would be an appropriate distinction to expand upon. Good. Yes, Al.
I'm not sure I've got the words to say to ask the question I'm trying to ask, but Andrew's question about the church or the larger community. It seems to me that Ambrose is wanting to be understood by anybody who will understand him, that there's a much larger mystery associated with mercy, misericordia, than anybody really recognizes. And that his words are primarily for church.
Right.
But the church is supposed to be the mover, the moving force toward that larger community. And so I think I very much agree with your sense that there's very little difference between in and out. It has more to do with the openness or ability of the hearer or reader to respond. Would that fit?
I think that's right, and therefore, to build on that, I might say it's the difference between perhaps the way Sokietos would be spoken of, say, in De Officiis, as opposed to on Joseph. I mean, if De Officiis is written to a larger audience than just the priests, and I believe it is, therefore the resonance with Sokietos clearly would, and the language of Sokietos and the virtual quotation from Cicero would obviously resonate with someone who was familiar with Cicero's De Officiis. But then in the context of catechesis, preparing, that's when you then move into the higher spiritual sense of there's a higher form of Sokietos that we open to you through Christ. So the one, you could think of it, the one being the bait to say, look, we share something in common, but then also if we don't scare you away and you decide to be baptized, we have something more to offer. Yeah, Brian.
What do you think Ambrose would make of the specific critique of MacIntyre, that what's sort of lacking in the tradition is this virtue of acknowledged dependency? Like, what would he do with that language? Is he actually filling that in, or does that remain a problem for the entire?
You mean for MacIntyre or for Ambrose?
For Ambrose.
Yeah, I think where the sense of mutual dependence is, and MacIntyre gets this with Thomas, but once again, his description of it isn't robustly Christian. Right? And by that I mean, the sense of mutual advantage is, my happiness is dependent on the happiness of my neighbor, such that part of my motivation is not to help my neighbor, is not out of largesse, is not out of seeking, to exalt oneself by patronage, but rather it is because fundamentally my experience of the flourishing that God intended for me is contingent upon the flourishing of my neighbor, such that if they are not flourishing, I am not flourishing, either materially or emotionally. So that's how I think you see the sense of the acknowledged dependence.
Yes. Of course, MacIntyre is writing for, at least presumably, for a philosophical argument and trying to kind of reboot a certain type of natural law theory, right? Do you think it gets off the ground then without Christ?
I mean, the fact that he goes, his MacIntyre's idea that he became a Catholic because, he thought Thomas was a better Aristotelian than Aristotle. And that's what he says. Therefore, the fact that he goes to Thomas shows, that I think he is operating within a Christian sphere. But there, the logic of it seems to be more grounded in a naturalistic argument about what misericordia does than a Christological understanding. Yeah, but
hi, thanks for doing this. We really appreciate it. I really need you to help me dig further. I want to go with Brian's question here. What is it exactly that makes Ambrose's arguments uniquely Christian? Because even to have compassion, we would hope that all people created in the image and likeness of God are capable of compassion. So I'm still not quite exactly sure what is it that's uniquely Christian about Ambrose's take on all this.
yeah, I think what he points to is the sense of forgiving one's enemies and doing it with, and therefore a Christian sense of justice that is without regard to person or without regard to merit. I didn't get to go into it, but I think one of the things that fascinates me is in his discussion of liberality in the De Officiis, the way in which he will talk about criteria for giving to people, but it is far more generous than what you find in Cicero and in Aristotle. And part of that comes from an understanding of what Christ has done for us. I do think one of the things that, one way in which Ambrose moral psychology gets expanded upon in a very positive way by Augustine is Augustine's sense that our misericordia for those who have sinned against us is that we have compassion for them in their sin and the way in which their life reflects a brokenness of sin. I mean, here's the concrete example I would give you. It was pretty easy for virtually everybody in the world to have a deep sense of compassion on 9/11. But how many people had a sense of compassion the day Osama bin Laden was killed by the Navy SEALs? You know, I mean, that, in Ambrose's sense, is carrying beyond, you know, what certainly is the norm, what would be natural. Because, you know, Osama bin Laden deserved what he got.
Can I carry just a bit further
sure.
here? I just want to push you a little bit here because
sure.
I really love what you're doing. It still strikes me that a good Muslim could achieve that conclusion. And it strikes me that what I read in Ambrose when he's talking about, especially misericordia, it's God will reward you with eternal life for having done your duty. So it seems to me that it's not replacing what Cicero is saying about being virtuous. It's just adding this extra little thing, not little salvation, a minor detail.
I'll take your abridgment of the statement.
But adding salvation on top of that, as God recognizing and the merits of your goodness.
Good. And I think one of the key points for him is precisely that perfection, whereas the adherent to the Officia Media is simply concerned with the present age, Officium Perfectum is concerned with the eschatological consequences, so that you look to the eternal good and not just to the temporal good. But part of that, an accompanying element, is the desire for the salvation, the eternal welfare of even your enemy.
Good.
And I think that's one of the things Augustine does with his language of the pilgrim to describe the Christian. The person who is on journey, but you can't journey together, you know, unless you want to be beat up on the road. You have to have traveling companions. And therefore there is that mutual need and a mutual love by the traveling companions for God, and then a recognition, I'm not going to get there on my own, but I have to have the other person traveling with me. And I think that's one thing that Augustine adds on to Ambrose's account of misericordia. Therefore, you would have compassion with the person who wasn't willing to go on the journey with you.
I asked you this at Oxford, so I'm going to ask you again.
Okay.
Does Ambrose think that Symmachus can go to heaven? That was your answer in Oxford, by the way.
Yeah. I don't think he's going to let Symmachus get in. I don't think he's going to be terribly hopeful about that. Yeah, but that's as far as I'll commit.
I'm sorry, that was bad. I'm awful.
No.
Well, maybe one more.
One more question.
Okay. Does Ambrose ever use language of compassio rather than, because I've noticed you translated misericordia rather than mercy, you translated compassion.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if that's intentional, or if there are other words that might be.
Yeah, I mean, I focused on misericordia because that was the language that kept coming up. In strategic places in a way that compassio didn't quite. But also the thing that I like about, the thing that I like, that's irrelevant. The thing that's important, I think, about misericordia is the way in which it carries both the sense of the act of mercy, acting mercifully, but also about that distress in one's own heart. that goes along with the experience of another's suffering. And therefore that affective element's what I see in Ambrose that I want to play. Thank you very much.